The BBC Director General Tim Davie has stepped down after the corporation has been accused of bias. Tim Davie, the BBC Director General and the head of BBC News, have resigned after a former advisor to the corporation accused it of serious and systemic bias in its coverage of issues including Donald Trump, Gaza and trans rights. In an announcement that caused shock within the corporation, Davie said his departure was entirely my decision, and it comes as the BBC prepares to apologise for the way it edited a Trump speech. Deborah Turnus, the head of BBC News, has also resigned. Sources within that department described a mood of dismay at Turnus's exit. It feels like a coup, one said. This is the result of a campaign by political enemies of the BBC. So what was the main thrust that caused this to happen? It was apparent a Donald Trump speech was edited in an episode of Panorama to mislead viewers. Michael Prescott, former independent external to the BBC, criticised the editing of Trump's speech in an edition of Panorama, which spliced together clips from an address the US president made on the 6th of January 2021. The edit suggested Trump told the crowd, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be there with you, and we fight like hell." This is the side-by-side edit of the Trump speech.
"We're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be there with you. And we fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. We're going to walk down to the Capitol and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore."
Now, I think it's clear from that cut that it's, increased the drama and made it look more apparent that Trump was goading on the insurrection. And yes, that is a misleading edit. But the ironic thing is that it didn't need an edit to do that, as Trump did incite January the 6th. The House of Representatives committee, which included both Democrats and Republicans, showed evidence that Trump incited January the 6th. I don't need to go into the full sort of breakdown of how exactly incited January the 6th, because it's been covered for so long. But it's, of my opinion, I think it's absolutely true that he did do that. So the edit was kind of not necessary. And I think it's just not off a question that Trump is to blame. But my view is that looking at this example, it seems less of a direct decision to push propaganda, but rather a lack of editorial integrity. Everyone knows that when showing clips, you put a transition such as a white fade between cuts to signal the passage of time. You'll see that we do that when covering speeches. But this isn't the first time Panorama has been in hot water. John Ware, who directed the documentary that looked into Labour antisemitism, compiled one of the most obvious hit jobs the BBC has ever done, which was then exposed by the Labour files.
A description of Marks and Bird's disciplinary interview features in the documentary. The interview is conducted by Ben Westerman, a party official who is Jewish.
Ben Westerman received dozens of complaints. While interviewing one member, he was confronted with the very anti-Semitism he'd been investigating.
And we finished the interview. The person got up to leave the room and then turned back to me and said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "What do you mean, where am I from?" And she said, "I asked you, where are you from?" And I said, "I'm not prepared to discuss this." And they said, "Are you from Israel?" What can you say to that? You are assumed to be in cahoots with the Israeli government. It's this obsession with that just spills over all the time into anti-Semitism.
Rika Bird speaks to Westerman at the end of the interview.
When he says, "Where are you from? Are you from Israel?" that's an absolute lie. I didn't say that.
With Westerman's permission, the two women record the interview.
The full recording shows what actually did happen.
Curious because I haven't been in the Labour Party very long and I've certainly never been to anything like this informal interview before. So I'm just curious about, what branch are you in?
I don't think that's relevant.
Okay.
I hope that's okay. I'm sorry, I don't think where I'm from is at all relevant to the investigation.
I did ask Westerman, what branch are you from? Meaning what branch of the Labour Party, because it was a Labour Party internal investigation. The word Israel never came into the exchange between me and Westerman.
Still, just can't believe it. I mean, the Labour Files to me is an incredible bit of journalism. I'm sure every single person watching this have seen it. If you haven't, go back and watch it. Right? I know, Jeremy Corbyn's no longer leader, but it's still integral to understand how bad the media weaponized the anti-Semitism crisis, and that is a million times worse than the bad edit of Trump. And again, I showed one clip of that Al Jazeera documentary. There's a whole host of other things, right? Look, it's true that the BBC is biased, right? It has an establishment Thatcherite outlet and obviously has a pro-Israel bias. Yet it's extremely ironic when right-wing media attacks the BBC for being biased, specifically GB News. In the last 12 months, how many unique individuals have made complaints against GB News? For which theirs was the only complaint on the programme, i.e. a complaint raised by one person, not multiple people. From the 12th of April 2023 to the 11th of April 2024, Ofcom has received 1,332 such complaints about GB News. Of these complaints, how many were investigated? 7 complaints were referred for investigation. Of these, the investigations into 6 of these complaints have concluded and 1 investigation is still ongoing. 38 complaints are currently undergoing assessment to determine if further investigation is warranted. How many were found to be in breach? Each of the 6 concluded investigations were found in breach of the Ofcom broadcasting code. How many were not found to be in breach? None. You literally have Nigel Farage, leader of the Reform Party, with his own show on GB News. Lee Anderson, Reform MP, he has his own show. Look, it's bad enough when you've got Ed Balls on GMB interviewing his own wife, Yvette Cooper. The point of the media is to hold power to account. But it's very funny watching right-wing figures call out BBC bias and then act like that GB News is the bastion of the truth. Lee Anderson tweeted this after Trump told people to watch GB News. There you go. Tune into GB News to get a fair and balanced view of the political world. Absolute insanity. Now, look, I have no issue with people attacking the BBC for obvious bias. We're literally doing that now. But when the right wing do it, they complain when they think it's either biased towards the left or one of their favourite politicians is attacked. Where is GB News calling out their Zionist propaganda? Funny that. Probably because of the fact that GB News is part of the corporate media who also push Zionist propaganda. Helena, before we talk about the right-wing media, what do you make of this BBC Trump episode?
I feel like sort of hot air of nothing, really. Like, sure, you might think that it changes the complexion of the original clip if they're doing it, as you said in your piece there, to make it seem a little bit more kind of exciting for the program they're broadcasting. But the fundamental facts are as you laid out, which is that he did say many things that were judged to have been incitement towards what happened at the Capitol Hill attack. Plenty of people who were there, who were interviewed, who were, they were arrested and interviewed about their participation in the Capitol Hill insurrection. Loads of those people also said they were doing it because Trump told them to. They were doing it on behalf of Trump. And the House of Representatives found that this was the case as well. Whereas I think you're right, it was sloppy, certainly. It was unnecessary. There's plenty of footage that you could have used. And even like the second half of that clip, just play that second half of that clip in full and you get the idea of what he was doing there. But it was just edited for effect with regards to the emotions of the piece rather than them trying to frame Trump as being somehow guilty when he was really innocent, when of course the motherfucker's guilty as sin, right? It's like OJ. But the bigger issue here is that this was part of a bigger thing coming from Mr. Prescott there about a whole host of issues which the BBC has shown bias in the other direction on a lot of times on the other things. But when it comes to Trump, a bunch of his supporters and people who support Trumpism don't quite realise just how far out of left field his presidency has been in both cases. Just how far outside the realms of acceptability what he has done is. And so there will be lots of scrutiny of Trump given this radical departure from the norm. And that scrutiny is not the same as bias. Because it's interesting that in none of the actual discussion of the Panorama episode did they talk about any of the claims that were made about what Trump did, about what Trump said, about Trump's conduct in office. All it is about, well, maybe this one clip here is a little misleading. And the idea that this could lead to the resignation of somebody like Tim Davie, when he was already there as a kind of right-wing plant anyway, and the news editor, because of one poor editing from someone who's not even in control of BBC News, like one smaller editor that would have done this, it seems to me like it's really a storm in a teacup as far as I'm concerned.
I'm glad you said that, because I was obviously wondering what your response is going to be. And I'm not one to defend the BBC, but this is the thing, right? When it comes to, yourself, myself, people that turn left, we're objective and we're not partisan. Right, so when the Labour Party, once in the blue moon, does something not too bad, we'll say that's not bad, but also we're generally quite critical of Labour. We're not partisan as in, like, we love Labour for being the red team or we hate them for being the red team, which is what you see from the right. And when it comes to the BBC, again, I think it used to be an institution which had some kind of respect. Now it's atrocious, although their culture stuff I still really enjoy. But if they're gonna, if I feel like they're warrant of sort of defending, then I'm going to do that. And I absolutely agree. Like, sure, that clip being stitched together can be misleading, right? I do think that's misleading. But the idea that this is like a resignation matter, or that this is a huge propaganda machine, it's insane to me. Because the fact is, as I said before, when you're editing, right, when you do jump cuts on speeches, for example, you put in a white fade to show the passage of time, right? The idea that just because you didn't put a white transition in means the difference between probably not going to cause a storm and causes a huge storm, that to me feels like it's overblown, right? Now, Tim Davie should resign, but he should resign over the fact that the BBC once again has given cover to a literal genocide. There are so many disgusting things that the BBC has given cover to or been biased of, which I think is appalling. To me, that will be a resignation offence, right? But this to me is giving in to the right-wing crybaby machine, because just as that Panorama clip of the Labour antisemitism scandal, right? You literally had that Westerman figure, I forgot his first name actually, literally lied about two Jewish left-wingers saying that, are you from Israel? And John Ware platformed that, along with a whole host of other bullshit in the BBC Panorama documentary. No one said anything because it was against the left. But, poor Trump is criticised or not seen very good. And, the whole establishment or right-wing establishment descends onto them. And again, I think you're absolutely right. Objective reporting means calling bullshit when something's bullshit, right? And you hear from, again, like GB News and the right-wing media, the media's so unfair on Donald Trump, it's not fair. Yes, okay, but that is true. I would say the media's largely critical of Trump, but the guy, in my opinion, is a fucking fascist. Like, there has to be an acceptable window where you start to go, do you know what? He should be criticised, because my big issue with the corporate media and the BBC is the false balance. It's like, we need to be balanced just for the sake of balance. You wouldn't, if it's raining outside, you wouldn't bring someone into the panel and say, well, it's not raining outside. We're being balanced, yeah, but it's not objective. So if Trump has bad coverage, it's just objective that he's very, very bad. I do want to ask about that. Like, what do you make of GB News and the right-wing outlets who are going after the BBC, and also the people that say, it has a left-wing bias?
I mean, there's so much to unpack here. There's a huge amount to unpack here. Now, when it comes to the issue of the BBC's bias institutionally, you said you don't want to defend the BBC. I will defend the BBC as an institution. I can criticise the way that it functions, but I think having the BBC as an institution is incredibly important. It's incredibly important, right? So if you look at the news sites people most go to in the United States, top of the pile is Fox News at about 25%, because every media organization in the United States, hyper-partisan. There is no public broadcaster. It's all done by funding or ideological alignment, and then people attach themselves to that kind of news output. In the UK, the BBC is the most watched when it comes to news, and it's 70%. That's an incredibly normalizing factor in terms of our media diet in this country that at least allows there to be some level of normalcy, somewhere where there should be objective, impartial reporting that people can go to and people have historically gone to. And in lots of cases, they've done a good job on. There are obviously lots of things we can criticize, and that's what the impartiality clause is there for. But that's a normalizing factor that is not the case in the United States. The reason why the right-wing media want to get rid of the BBC, and this is why these attacks keep coming from the right-wing media, from the Telegraph and GB News. These are things that are part of the Paul Marshall extended universe of right-wing grift machines, is because they don't want to have views that they disagreed with platformed in the same way. So when you look at a corporate-funded news organization, whether it's liberal or conservative, because of course what it never is socialist, because why would corporations fund something that is opposed to corporations? Whether it's liberal or conservative, there is that implicit pro-capital bias. That shouldn't be the same in the BBC. Now, it does have its bias problems. I will go into that in a second. But the right wing are constantly engaging in these attacks because of, first of all, their desire to have all media done for money, for all media to go through the lens of corporate ownership and therefore all have pro-corporate bias. Second of all, it's because fundamentally a lot of conservatives, a lot of right-wingers just are not very good at media literacy. They will look at the BBC not agreeing with their view specifically and think that means that's a bias rather than a level of impartiality that doesn't specifically mollycoddle their particular positions. We saw this just last week as well. I'll get another BBC scandal story where one of their news presenters and one of their anchors, Martine Croxall, she was brought up as having failed impartiality because during a segment on climate change and its effects, she read out a quote from a scientist about how this would impact individuals, and that quote used the term pregnant people. And she put out a weird facial expression and edited that to say pregnant women, because in TERF minds, women aren't people. So describing pregnant people feels wrong to them, even though it's an inclusive phrase that would include women, even if you didn't believe that trans men were men, for example. But I digress. Either way, people are getting mad at the BBC for correctly upholding their impartiality clause because it doesn't confirm their worldview. Because they actually don't want an impartial BBC. They want a BBC that's partial to them. Because the reality is also true when it came to Martine Croxall, is if it was the other way around, and she had said to change it to pregnant people rather than pregnant women with a smirk, that would also not be impartiality because it was reading a quote from somebody else. She's not allowed to do this in either direction, but they're getting mad because she's not doing it in the way that is of their interest. And that was something else was included from that Mark Prescott piece where he was critical of the BBC, is that they're too pro-trans, if you can imagine such a thing. Because I've personally never been experienced pretty much a lot of pro-trans reporting from the BBC. That's a huge issue. So there's just a huge media bias problem when it comes to the right wing. When it comes to the actual institutional bias of the BBC, and I think there is a bias, but it's not biased because it's the BBC. It's not biased because it's a public broadcaster. It's not biased because of its impartiality clause. It's biased because it is an institution that includes journalists from the UK. If you look at breakdown by our population in terms of profession and then broken down by whether they went to state or private school, the broader population is 93% state educated and 7% private educated. You look at our journalists, they are 52% privately educated. The majority of ours are privately educated, despite them making a tiny proportion of the UK public. And so, having gone through the same schooling system, loads of them have gone to Oxford and Cambridge, right, to institutions that perpetuate similar ideas. They will move from institution to institution. Like Allegra Stratton's worked for BBC ITV. She was a press officer for Boris Johnson at one point as well, famously caught up in the Partygate scandal. And they will take their biases with them wherever they go. Whatever they have learned as received wisdom in the private education system, in the private school system, in the Oxbridge system, right? They will carry those unwritten assumptions with them wherever they go within our media ecosystem. For example, there was an internal report the BBC did on themselves, which you wouldn't have gotten if it was a partisan outlet. The BBC actually has these clauses to enforce impartiality, to check its own biases, to try and be able to make its coverage better. It doesn't do a good job all the time, and I think it's worth to be critical, especially in the case of things like Israel-Palestine. But in this specific case, it was about their economics coverage, and they found that there was systemic bias in their reporting about economics, not because anyone was trying to, but because their own reporters didn't know enough about economics, that they were taking positions such as debt is always bad or public spending reductions are always bad as being prima facie correct positions, when that isn't necessarily true in either of those cases. It's just that's what they learned from doing PPE or Oxford, whatever it is, and they carried those biases with them. If we really want to solve structural problems in our media reporting in this country, first of all, cut the corporate funding. Second of all, democratize the BBC, make it more accountable to the people broadly rather than being at arm's length of the public. I think that'd be a good way of injecting more public consent and public involvement in the BBC so that people have an active role in shaping the news coverage that's funded on their behalf through public money. And another part of that is just have better journalists with a more diverse set of backgrounds, and if you might not have that same level of manufactured consent. Because you've got to remember, as Chomsky put to Andrew Marr, these people almost certainly all believe that everything that they're saying is true and they're not ideologically inclined in the first place. But if they didn't have those same ideological inclinations in terms of the corporate media, they wouldn't have been hired because they're not pushing the right position. And in terms of the BBC and our public media, they wouldn't have been part of that media ecosystem in the first place to move from another organisation to the BBC and vice versa. It's a really, really difficult situation that we're in with the BBC because it has such a high level to which that it expects impartiality, that people can fall foul of this very, very easily. And it sometimes goes too far. Like you look at Gary Lineker, who in his own personal capacity was saying things about Israel-Palestine that caused him to have to leave the organisation, which was nothing to do with what happened, anything on air. Unlike Martin Croxall, who's been even more ideologically inclined in terms of the discussion than Gary Lineker was, but she did it in her role as a BBC anchor, not in a private capacity as a citizen on Twitter. And the fact that these things don't even get brought up, I find very, very frustrating, because it's good to have public media. It is good to have publicly funded media. It's good to have the enshrined impartiality. But what we can do, and what we always must be, is critical of how that is gone. So anyone wants to criticise the jump cut or whatever it is from Panorama, or the Labour Files investigations into Panorama, or whatever's happening in terms of their broader coverage, that criticism is welcome. But it shouldn't be used as a move to try and demolish and dismantle the BBC as an institution. It's criticism to make the BBC better and hold it to the principles it was founded upon. That's what the reality is here. And that's why I differ from a Nigel Farage. It's why I would differ from a Paul Marshall and a GB News, is that I firmly believe in the public body representing itself through public broadcasting, and these people want that torn down because it is a benchmark against their right-wing corporatist propaganda.
I mean, that was superbly put. And by the way, I just want to clarify, when I said I don't want to defend the BBC, I hate the BBC editorial as it is now. I do believe in a public institution. And for those that are watching, I recommend read Tom Mills's book on the BBC. It's called The Myth of the Public Broadcast Institution, but it's a really good book. And I've spoken to Tom Mills, and he said, look, I believe in the public institution. We need to democratize it. Because, Helena, where you're absolutely right, in which you're not going to get this analysis, right? No one's going to get your expert analysis anywhere else on Twitter or right-wing media. The problem is journalism. The problem is elitism, and it's probably because they all go to private schools. I mean, I remember when we were talking about the economics myths that the BBC was pushing out, was when Laura Koonsberg was saying, we've maxed out the credit card. Again, it's obviously not deliberate propaganda. And getting rid of the BBC just means you have the entirety of the media basically being corporate owned. Besides Channel 4, but guess what? The right wing been gunning after that as well. So I absolutely agree. I mean, no one is immune from propaganda, though. I mean, and I've seen it on Twitter, and I've got ratioed for this take on Twitter, which is wild to me. Shows that you're right. No one has media literacy, right? If you think ditching the BBC to watch another outlet, such as GB News, right? You're not freeing yourself from propaganda or bias. You're just getting a different flavour of bias. The point, right, is to be a critical thinker. Right? Taking news from multiple sources, never treating one specific outlet as the truth, right? Don't do that. When everyone says, I watch this for the truth, they're conspiracy loons, right? Because bias does exist everywhere. But you look at multiple different outlets, you collect the information, and use your own brain to work out what's true, right? People who only watch one outlet and then call it the truth or not seeing the truth, they are being propagandized.